This is Still Enrolled.
And welcome on into the latest edition of Still Enrolled, a Big Ten football podcast. As always, Ryan Hickey alongside Brian Tripp. What an episode we have for you here today. Boy, we got a big week 7 coming up here, but before we get to that, Tripp, what we thought was maybe a chalky, sleepy week number 6 turned out to be anything but over the weekend on Saturday as Big Ten teams went down, other teams across the country went down. It was a chaotic week in a college football week number 6.
Yeah, usually in college football, when you have a sleepy schedule, we should have known, right? We should have known that when there's not that highlight marquee matchup, those are usually the weeks where the most chaos ensues. And that's exactly what we had. 5 of the top 11 teams go down. 6 of the top 25 teams lost. A Big Ten unbeaten goes down this week. And then we have the stage set for a monster week number 7. But here we are, Monday, October 7th. And a lot of what we thought we knew about college football might be out the window. And we enter week 7 with the Big Ten having 3 of the top 4 teams in the AP poll.
You were absolutely right about that. Like you said, we had 3 SEC teams in the top 11 go down, 2 Big Ten teams in the top 11 go down in Michigan and USC at 10 and 11 at the time, respectively. So with all the chaos we saw, like you just mentioned, 6 teams in the top 25 going down, 5 of them to unranked teams. How does this impact the Big Ten here, Tripp? Like you mentioned, right now, out of the top 5, 2, 3, and 4 are taken up by Big Ten teams. How does all this chaos we saw unfold on Saturday impact the Big Ten in your mind moving forward?
Well, I think there was the expectation that a team like Alabama, a team like Tennessee, some of those teams in the SEC, Georgia already having that loss to Alabama last week, that those teams are going to beat up on each other throughout the course of the season. So, you expect those teams to get a loss or two, but against those other teams at the top of the SEC. Now, all of a sudden, Alabama losing to a Vanderbilt, Tennessee losing to an Arkansas, that positions them to have, when you look at the rest of their schedule, 2, 3 losses. And I think this opens the door for teams that might finish the year between 10 and 15 that are sitting at 10. Anyone in the top 25 right now, you're thinking, hey, I might be able to creep my way into a college football playoff position because of what is ensuing in the SEC, and that is mayhem. There is so much parity in college football. There is so much talent in college football, and this is what you are hoping for with this 12-team expanded playoff, to give teams, and I think we're both going to agree on this, the team that benefits the most, especially after Rutgers lost to Nebraska this weekend, and Nebraska certainly benefits from these results, but the team that benefits the most from this is a Big Ten team, and that is the Indiana Hoosiers. Now, I think the door is wide open for Indiana as they dominated Northwestern. They're one of those teams, Indiana, Illinois, those types of fringe teams in the Big Ten. They are now positioned to make a run at a college football playoff berth. Again, a lot to play out. The SEC teams are still all going to be in contention, but it does take them off that pedestal a little bit, knowing that one of those top 3 Big Ten teams is going to be handed a loss this weekend with Oregon and Ohio State squaring off.
You're right, and I couldn't agree more with Indiana. Like you're sitting there, like you said, you're halfway through your schedule right now. It's 6-0. Kirk Ferentz done a tremendous job, and I think the path is wide open for right now the Hoosiers because I think 2 things here. Number one, you look at their schedule, like you mentioned, they have a bye week coming up. Then their next game is at Nebraska, who should still be ranked. So that'll be the first ranked test here for the Hoosiers on their schedule so far. But again, we've talked about they have Michigan coming to town. They're going to Ohio State. If they're able to take care of business and win the games they were favored, or they will be favored to win, which I'm going to assume will be every game but Ohio State. If we were talking about an 11-1 Indiana team, number one, probably most likely, depending on the tiebreakers here, in Indy playing for a Big Ten title. If not, I think you could say maybe even better. You're 11-1 right now and should have a great chance to make the playoff. I think the other thing going for them right now is not only their schedule, but like you just said, when you look at Alabama losing to Vandy, Tennessee losing to Arkansas, even USC losing to Minnesota, why that helps Indiana and why they should now really catapult up is while they've not played anybody tough, what they have done has been taking care of business. Where they put up 40 points in every game so far. They've won by double, like they have blown out their opponents or won handily in every single game they've played. They've played inferior opponents, but they've taken care of business every time where they've really not had that close of a game or that close of a call for the most part so far. Where you look at some of these other close calls and teams scraping by or losing, I think right now how Indiana's won, along with right now being 6-0 and their schedule setting up for them to be 11-1, this is a great opportunity right now where I would say, Trip, it would be more of a surprise to have them not in the playoff at this point than in the playoff.
Well, I think that it is an extreme leap right there. I think they've positioned themselves to make a run. But remember, this is a team that just really has no historical precedent in being successful. Kirk Cignetti has done an unbelievable job. 4 of their last 6 are at home. That Nebraska game is in Bloomington. Washington in Bloomington. Michigan in Bloomington. Now, all of those true toss ups, right, with those opponents, especially the way that Washington played and their passing attack, what they did to Michigan this past weekend. Michigan, I think there were some signs of life in their game, and I know we're going to get to that matchup a little bit later on. But the only time they have to leave, they have 2 road games, and they're both in November at Michigan State and at Ohio State. Here's the most important thing. There's a bye between Michigan and Ohio State. Playing those 2 teams back to back with the physicality of Big Ten football is nearly impossible. But they have a bye between those 2 games. And as you said, they have a bye this week before hosting Nebraska. The schedule does set up well for them. I think it's a giant leap to say, oh, 11-1, this is a playoff team right now with that schedule. I'm not quite there yet. But they certainly have an opportunity. It's teams like Indiana in that position. And it's not just Big Ten teams. Obviously, I think the Big 12 really benefits from the weekend that the SEC had. There's teams out there now that you start to feel like, hey, the SEC doesn't have as much of a stranglehold on this thing as we originally thought. And then the other wild card is somehow the ACC is still in a nice position because Miami is the great Houdini team in all of college football. If you're a Big Ten fan, you're going, how the heck's that team still undefeated? But really, a crazy week. And it's fun to watch not only these Big Ten games, but seeing what transpires elsewhere. I mean, college football is amazing. It is so much fun to watch the unpredictability week to week on what we said was a ho-hum week number 6. It was anything but.
Diego Pavia being upset that he's been called a poor man's Trace McSorley. I don't know. I guess that's a diss or not. I would say that's a pretty good compliment. Pretty good quarterback to compare to. But chaos reigned supreme again. And that's why I said the sport is the best. One thing here before we kind of dive into some games and surprising outcomes, you mentioned the AP poll results coming out of the chaos, right? Where now you see Ohio State slide up to number 2, Oregon 3, Penn State 4. And you look at the rest of the Big Ten, 18 now sits Indiana, Illinois is at 23, Michigan's 24. The thing that confuses me, Trip, here is this. When you look at some of the teams that slid down that lost, right? We talked about Alabama. They lost to Vanderbilt. They slid 6 spots. That's it. Tennessee lost to Arkansas. They slid 4 spots. When you look at Michigan and you look at USC, I know they have an extra loss on their schedule compared to Alabama and Tennessee. But Michigan lost, as by the way, a road dog to Washington. They slid 14 spots in the rankings to number 24, and USC slid 15 spots out of the rankings. They're right now, if you want to call them the 26th team because they have the most votes outside of the top 25, they went from 11 to 26. Do you agree with the massive jump or the massive, I should say, fall of Michigan and USC compared to the slight fall of Alabama and Tennessee?
It really is irrelevant, but it is interesting to see because at the end of the year, ultimately, it is voters determining who's going to be and a committee determining who are going to be those 12 teams in the college football playoff. I think time ultimately will tell, but Alabama does have the win over Georgia. And the eye test will tell you that's a really good Alabama team that got itself stuck in a trap game against Vanderbilt. Tennessee already has beaten Oklahoma. So I think it's the marquee wins and just one loss for the time being. You excuse those teams. Tennessee will host Florida this week, but then Tennessee, Alabama, one of those teams now guaranteed to have a second loss coming up as early as October 19th, with Tennessee still needing to go to Georgia in November. This is where things start to get a little fluky here in the SEC, and it's going to be interesting to see the quality of the conference at the end of the year and how they evaluate that in terms of the overall rankings. I'm not surprised by it, especially USC going on the road and losing to Minnesota. I mean, we were just talking about the job security of PJ Fleck a podcast or two ago, and now USC has lost back to back Big Ten road contests against Michigan and against Minnesota, and look where they sit. So I think it's probably deserved for those programs. Remember, USC started outside the polls. They beat LSU, so they catapult up, and now they're kind of back where they were to start the year. Don't read too much into it, but it at least is worth mentioning, knowing that the value the committee will put on certain conferences and teams as the year plays out.
That's why I think it does matter here. It's
Hmm.
just because, like, when you are looking now, the college football playoff rankings, which are the only ones that matter, don't come out
Hmm.
till about another month or so, right
Yep.
around Halloween time. So they are going to take, right. It's not just going to be a week by week. They're going to take really the entirety of the first 2 months into account. And
Hmm.
so if you look at a team like Penn State, who now goes on the road at USC, well, if USC had a 24 next to the name of a 26, does that now impact if Penn State, let's say, wins that game? Does that impact their strength of schedule? If you look at Indiana, let's say, if they're playing an
Yeah.
unranked Michigan team, how does that, like? I think it does matter. And again, I know they have each team, USC and Michigan, has an extra loss compared to Alabama and
Hmm.
Tennessee, and I just don't. I just don't personally understand the precipitous fall that we saw those two teams have, despite the fact they had, like, the losses were similar. It wasn't like Alabama lost on the road to Georgia or Tennessee lost on the road to LSU. They lost to teams on the road that they were far better than and massive favorites in. And that's the only thing I just don't get is just the drastic drop off between two teams in the SEC, two teams in the Big Ten, and all four, you put them in the bucket together. The losses were very similar in terms of how bad they were. You can maybe even, if you want to exclude Michigan, because again, they were a road dog and the other three were favorites at least. But that's the only thing where it's like, as you look at the season, when you look at strength of schedule, when you look at impressive wins, I don't trust the committee right now to take into account that USC is still a solid team. And instead of just writing them off as, oh, they lost to Minnesota, they suck, that win that Penn State had, or that win that another team has against them is not that impressive. That's my concern here.
When you have a committee, when you have people, when you have human beings, there's always going to be that element of the name brand of the program. I mean, we've seen it for forever. That
True.
is going to play a part in deciding who goes to the college football playoff this year. What is interesting, though, is we really don't know the criteria yet because it is the first year of a 12-team playoff. Is it the value of a quality win? Is it looking at a game? This is something we were discussing during the Penn State UCLA broadcast on Saturday. Penn State was up 27-3 at the end of the game, and UCLA went on a 6-minute drive with absolutely no urgency. They were running the football, but it wasn't like they weren't trying to score. UCLA was trying to put together a drive. And as that drive continued and you're in the waning moments, Penn State head coach James Franklin was using a timeout. He rotated some starters back in. And what was a 27-3 game ends in the final seconds. Completely irrelevant USC touchdown, but it's 27-11 instead. And the question I posed as Penn State started to rotate some starters back onto the field was, number one, you're playing for pride, and there are coachable moments for all parties involved, USC or UCLA and Penn State in that instance. But if you're a head coach in college football, is this also in the back of your mind? 27-3 looks a whole heck of a lot better than 27-11 at the end of the day. And is that something you're considering your margin of victory in a game like that? It was a bizarro sequence for UCLA. Really, hey, we're putting up the white flag. We're going to try to score, but the white flag's raised for Deshaun Foster. But if you're Penn State, are you trying to hold them out so you get style points? And again, I don't know in the heat of the moment where but that has to be something that coaches are discussing with their staffs during the week as these top teams try to position themselves the best for a playoff berth. But we just don't know the criteria yet.
like you said, the 12-team playoff, the committee does kind of rotate as well. So some people value different things. It is right now, like you said, a total guessing game in terms of what matters and what is not as important here that we won't find out for another month or so. But I think you're right. Like, I think that has to creep into a coach's mind. And we'll see really in November too, once we get a stronger idea of what the committee values versus what they don't. I think you also see have that, impact some game management as well here in terms of teams maybe pulling off the reins or still going for it to get those style points, get those covers, if you will, to impress the committee here as we do close on the college football playoff here. So we talked about week 6 chaos, and it wasn't just in the top 25, Chip, right? We had a lot of chaos here and unexpected results in the Big Ten here for week number 6. If I ask you, take all the games into account here, the most surprising outcome in your opinion from the Big Ten in week 6 was what?
Minnesota coming from behind to defeat 11th ranked USC at home, and it was a good environment. That can be a tough place to play, Huntington Bank Stadium, but Minnesota 24, USC 17, the final. Do you agree like that? There's certainly a lot of results and some things that stand out from the week, but to me, in terms of a final score, how we got there, the way it transpired, Minnesota beating USC, most surprising.
100%. 100% in part because of just the opponent. Minnesota has not showed you that they are a truly talented team capable of beating some of the better teams in the conference. But also, too, when you look at how this game played out, if you're USC, right, like one of the concerns of USC coming to the conference this year was how are they going to do in the physicality perspective, right?
Yeah.
And this was a game where they had balance offensively. They ran the ball really well. Woody Marks had over 100 yards. They actually had a balanced offense that should have opened it up for Miller Moss. But what have we been talking about, Chip, the last few weeks with USC? Their biggest bugaboo has been what? Turnovers. And now we're seeing yet again for the second time in 3 weeks, the turnover bug really come back to bite them. They're able to avoid it against Wisconsin because they're just a better team. But even in a game where I would argue Wisconsin is better than Minnesota, so you're playing a worse opponent, those turnovers come back to bite you. You lose the game. You have to be sick to your stomach if you're a USC fan because the 2 losses you have this year aren't because the other team was better than you, out-executed more than you. It's because you have had self-inflicted penalties and turnovers that have caused you to lose these games against teams that you are better than.
Yeah, the USC offensive line, look, in the trench is a question for USC, but the offensive line is the weak spot of their offense. Ultimately, they played better than they had. And Lincoln Riley said this after the game. They played better. You look at the rushing attack, Woody Marks, but the untimely pass protection breakdowns, USC driving in the fourth quarter, trying to put that game out of reach and make it a 2-score game. They're at the Minnesota 35. Moss gets hit. Minnesota gets a takeaway. Minnesota 6 plays later ties the football game. And this is a Gopher team that nearly came from behind last week on the road at Michigan. And you got to give PJ Fleck and Max Brosmer some credit here. And I think this is where the experience of Brosmer has played off this year. He had them in position to beat UNC in week number 1. Didn't play a great game, but he put them down the field in position to win the game. They missed a field goal. Here goes down the field, end of the game. And honestly, I thought Minnesota should kick the ball on that 4th and goal because you get the 3 points. And I think at that point, you're guaranteed at least to get to overtime in the game, even if USC can get into field goal range and make a kick. But you get stopped there, as they almost did, a controversial play, and all of a sudden, all bets are off, and you just lost your opportunity to take a lead. It was a gutsy play. They pushed it into the end zone. And, even after the game, like that leads to that awkward situation after the game where a reporter asked Jamil Muhammad if he thought Brosmer was in the end zone, and Lincoln Riley interrupted and said, "Nah, don't ask him that. Ask a professional question." It just feels like the frustration, how these games transpired, USC giving them away more than the other team winning it, and that's not to discredit Michigan and Minnesota, but they have some real concerns right now, even though they've been in position to win, they haven't. And now your schedule is just going to get even tougher with Penn State coming to town.
Let me ask you if I'm reaching here too much. Again, you're the
Mm-hmm.
voice of reason on this pod. This thought popped to my head after really that, like you said, that post-game media availability where Lincoln Riley cuts off a question, kind of scolds the reporter. This is not the first time he's done that. When the Bear Alexander news came down, he started his press conference by saying, "We're not talking about it." He has had a propensity at both Oklahoma, but now especially at USC, where he has not answered any hard question. And I think I'm starting to see a connection between kind of maybe avoiding the tough questions and being honest with yourself
Mhm.
and a turnover problem that is rampant, that is not getting fixed. Can you see a correlation here between where maybe Lincoln Riley's not having an honest conversation with himself, with Miller Moss, with the coaching staff to truly do what it takes to fix some of these small errors? Because now this is the third week in a row we've seen these errors pop up and they bit them in the butt 2 out of the 3 times. Is there any sort
Mhm.
of correlation of just like avoiding tough questions, maybe not wanting to answer the hard questions and seeing the same issues pop up week in and week out now?
I think here he's protecting his player because his player is going to say something controversial, and you don't want to make headlines with something that your student athlete says in this spot. However, I do think Lincoln Riley's starting to feel the pressure. Look, USC, the expectations were not incredibly high going into the year. They can still get to where they, 8, 9 win season. I think is a good year for them in their first year in the Big Ten. But now going into a game against Penn State, a Penn State team that has a dominant defensive front against a weak USC offensive front, you lose that game, playoffs, Big Ten title, all that is out. They have to run the table the rest of the way. And no
Mhm.
matter what the expectations are coming into the year, even if they're a little bit lower for USC this season, it is still a program that is supposed to be a national championship contending program every year. And as I told you at the start of the year, the coach I thought had the most pressure this year in the Big Ten was actually Lincoln Riley. And I think he is starting to feel that pressure now. Losing, it's one thing to lose at Michigan. It's another thing to lose at Minnesota, a team that has really struggled, knowing you're going back home to take on Penn State, top five Penn State the following weekend. They are in a tough spot right now, and I think Lincoln Riley's starting to look long term at what the future holds for the 2024 season, and that's why you start to generate some of those reactions.
And it's not just two for USC right now. It's not just Penn State and Notre Dame that come to town. But
Yeah.
you also have to deal with Rutgers, who's been a tough team. Nebraska's been a tough team. Washington's been a tough team.
Hmm.
Like, I mean, you start to look, that 7-5 record they had last year, that was an abomination. So, I mean,
Hmm.
that could be a repeat here in 2024 yet again quickly with a loss like this. Like you said, it's one of those that can
Yep.
kind of change the trajectory. It's problematic.
I'm glad you mentioned Washington because I think their 27-17 win over Michigan in the rematch of last year's national championship game, well, maybe not surprising because I thought that we both thought that, right? We talked on
Right.
Thursday that this is a really good matchup for Washington, but they impressed in finding a way to get it done against the Wolverines. Will Rogers, he just picked on Jair Hill on the outside. Michigan's passing defense is a monumental concern right now. But Rogers, 21 of 31, 271 yards, a couple of touchdowns. Michigan's pass defense now ranks 114th nationally, and their pass defense gave up 315 yards. Injuries are mounting on that back end, but that's a really quality win, albeit favorites at home, but that's a quality win for Washington over Michigan and a signature win for Jed Fish here so far to start this 2024 season.
You're absolutely right. And you look at, how they lost to
Mhm.
Washington State, how they lost to Rutgers as well. Being able this week to finish the job late, like you said, get
Yep.
an interception, get a score to go ahead by 2 scores. Like they finished the game. And like you said, you see growth in this first year under Jed Fisher that is really encouraging. On the flip side, though, from Michigan's perspective here, Trip,
Yep.
we had another quarterback change. The third
Huh.
quarterback now plays for Michigan. We go from Davis Warren to Alex Orji to now the old man on campus and Jack Tuttle. And it shows and it highlights the state
Mhm.
of the Michigan passing offense, where you could talk about a guy who came in and played most of the game and only threw for 98 yards and had 2 turnovers in Jack Tuttle, but still also at the same time say he by far looked the best out of the three.
Yep.
And I think this is the answer now for Michigan. But again, I just go back to where, like, was he just not this good in the preseason? Like, he clearly brings veteran experience. He clearly has an
Mhm.
understanding of the offense. I just don't know if you're what took so long to get here.
And Donovan Edwards said after the game, Tuttle brought a spark. He's 25 years old. He's in his seventh year as a college quarterback. And Tuttle basically is going to leave campus with a PhD in college football. He took over the first three possessions, to your point, Ryan, went 7 plays at least and 55 yards at least, and grew to 17 straight points. Now, what happened to Michigan? Their 24 game Big Ten win streak was snapped because of two costly turnovers in the fourth quarter of that football game. So it's those turnovers down the stretch that cost Michigan. But I think even though the result wasn't there, they at least found their guy for the rest of the year. Now, this doesn't solve the long-term quarterback issue that Michigan's going to have, and Dave Portnoy's $3 million can't come to Ann Arbor fast enough to fix the problem because right now they do not have a long-term future quarterback on their roster. Alec Orji, and I think this is why they went with Davis Warren and Alex Orji. They were hoping to have something for the future, knowing that this is a retooling year for them, not expected to be a playoff contender. I think that is why Jack Tuttle did not get the ball from week one. I think Michigan has a better record with Tuttle as the starting quarterback from week number one, and they look better at this point of the year. I think it's a step forward for them, believe it or not, even in a game that they lose late to Washington on the road.
You're right, but it's still one of those steps where, like you said, this year
Mhm.
is lost for the Wolverines in terms of Big Ten title contention, playoff contention. And now it's just about trying to pick up the pieces to figure out what quarterback, either in the portal or out there in high school, can we bring in to really kind of get this offense going here and get us on the right track. Speaking of,
Especially, I just want to add one more thing, especially because you don't have a defense that you can just rely upon to close out and win a game right now. It is a defense that has injuries. It's a defense that has holes. And you said, despite 3 first-round potential NFL draft picks on that defense, at all levels of that defense, you said going into the year, a serious question about the secondary outside of Will Johnson. And that has proven to be a very accurate take.
it's also, too, like when you look at bringing in Wink Martindale, a guy who
Mhm.
loves to blitz, right? Everywhere he's been, he's a blitz guy. Well, that puts pressure on the secondary. And right now, that pressure is not holding up whatsoever. They're not getting home consistently. And when you're giving quarterbacks time or facing a good passing offense, they have really struggled, like you said, on the
Mhm.
back end here to stop anybody. And it doesn't look like changes are coming anytime soon,
Yep.
at least for this year, for the Wolverines. Um, how about some offensive explosion here from Wisconsin? Maybe a little asterisk because it was against Purdue, but how
Yeah.
about Braden Locktrip?
359 yards, 3 touchdowns. Tretch. Oh, come on. I got to get it. I
Come
practiced
on.
it before the show. Tretch Kekahunen with 6 receptions, 134 yards, and a couple of touchdowns. We want to get to the game of the week, at least that we saw, and it was Ohio State's first test and coming, just a huge second half against Iowa. But we have to mention, right? A Wisconsin team that's been so beleaguered this year puts up 52 points against Purdue, wins it 52-6. And hey, maybe they do have a little bit of a passing game. And this was much, much needed. Just like PJ Fleck needed a win, Wisconsin needed a win. Luke Fickell needed a win. It certainly leaves some questions. I believe we both really are going out on a limb and putting Purdue last in our power rankings this week.
Spoiler alert for the end of the show. Yeah, Purdue will
Mhm.
be 18th out of 18 on both of our rankings here. We got a nice, fancy graphic, by the way, so make sure you stay
Woo!
at the end for that. We're going to look fancy as hell. But yeah, I think if you're Ryan Walters here, allowing 52 points and allowing your defense as a defensive minded guy to get shredded, yeah, I think you're feeling a little warmth under that behind of
Mhm.
yours. That seat is only getting warmer and warmer. The little lower third we have here, Chip, if you're watching on
Yep.
YouTube, most surprising Big Ten outcome. That's kind of the theme since we had a lot of surprising outcomes here in week number 6. I don't think we could say Ohio State winning 35-7 was a
Yeah.
surprising outcome over Iowa, can we?
No, and this was the game we kind of spotlighted going into the week, a week that we thought may produce some good games, but there really wasn't that what we have coming up this week in a top five team going on the road against a perennial power. You have Ohio State visiting Oregon in a top five matchup, but it was Ohio State's first quote unquote test of the season. We both felt like Iowa didn't have the horses and the power to keep up with Ohio State as good as that Iowa defense can be. And I think it's good, not great this year. Ohio State's skills on offense and their talent on offense, they're still going to get points. And Iowa wasn't going to be able to score to keep up with Ohio State. But Ohio State kept the door ajar in the first half because of mistakes, right? They start with that 14-play, 88-yard touchdown drive. Then Will Howard was stopped on a 4th-and-2 run. Jeremiah Smith, he's pretty good. He fumbled the football. Howard threw an interception. But ultimately, Ohio State blows them out. Third quarter was massive. It's a 35-7 Ohio State victory. And coming out of this, not only with what they did offensively in the second half, but holding Caleb Johnson to 87 yards, 4 sacks, 9 tackles for loss. Ohio State answered, and we'll get to see what they really are. And I think get to see what Oregon really is when they square off this weekend.
The result, like you said, is not surprising. Iowa's
Yep.
offense just stinks right
Mhm.
now. It was actually the first time in a long time that Iowa's actually scored points against a ranked opponent. So Ohio State's defense, how great they are. They've done something that no other team since 2022 has done, which is allow Iowa's offense to score against them. Granted, it's one touchdown. We're not going to get crazy here. But, like, they won handily, pulled away late.
Yep.
Again, you look at the box score, you look at the stats. Will Howard, 5 total touchdowns. If you watch any highlights, Jeremiah Smith does it again. Why he's not getting the ball every single pass just because it's impossible to cover this guy is beyond me. But like you mentioned, there was a 3-drive stretch where you had 2 turnovers and a stop on 4th down for Ohio State.
Mm-hmm.
Is that how much of a concern is that for you when you look at that? It clearly was not the difference against Iowa. The offense is not good enough to capitalize on that. But that could be the difference in Ohio State losing to Oregon next week. Was that just a little sloppy play that they'll figure it out? Or is that a little bit of a concern now going into this huge test on Saturday in Eugene?
This isn't Kent State that they're playing, and no team is perfect. I think Ohio State was so dominant in that game, even though they had some hiccups early. I'm not concerned about that at all. And you're seeing what Will Howard's athleticism can bring to their offense. It's an elite Ohio State defense. And if what will keep the door open for teams is mistakes. You can't make the turnovers, but I'm not concerned about it because of what we saw take place on Saturday.
The more I watch this season, the more I really struggle with
Mhm.
believing in Oregon's defense to get
Yep.
consistent stops on Saturday. And that's the only thing that's concerning is, like you said, I think the only sign of life that Oregon can have defensively is getting these turnovers and getting quick, short fields, quick change of momentum here. If
And
Howard can,
they And they weren't perfect either. And I don't mean to
no,
jump in and interrupt, but
no,
Oregon also had 2 red zone interceptions from Dylan Gabriel in their win over Michigan State on Friday, and they still won that big. They got their run game going. Their run defense has been maybe a little bit better. They're like this is an Oregon team that's gotten better every week too. I think it's just 2 teams. Oregon's played a slightly tougher schedule. But it's not like they've played world beaters. They played Ashton Genty from Boise State, and no one stopped him so far this
right.
season. Maybe the scoreboard has, so they take him out at halftime, third quarter. That's the only way that his numbers aren't going to be completely ridiculous. But it's 2 teams that they haven't played a top 10 team, haven't played a top 15 team. It's 2 teams that have played really well. You're going to have some hiccups, and I'm not concerned about either of the turnover. For me, Ohio State's the better team, and we're going to do a full preview on Thursday. But Ohio State's the better team because of where they're at on the defensive line. I think if it comes down to the trenches, Ohio State's defensive line against Oregon's offensive line could be a real advantage for them, and Ohio State's defense is better. But I don't extrapolate much out of the results of this past weekend.
Okay, that's fair. That's
Mhm.
probably the measure take to have.
Mhm.
You know me, don't get
Yeah.
wrapped up here in small sample sizes. That's for sure.
What does this mean though for Iowa? You go on the road, you had that tough loss to Iowa State. Everyone thought this is going to be a great year, but this is their 8th straight loss to an AP ranked team. No one thought they'd beat Ohio State, but the average margin of defeat now in those games is 27 points per game. And you're trying to make all that improvement on offense this year, new offensive coordinator. And Cade McNamara still does not have a passing touchdown against the Power 4 opponent as Iowa's quarterback.
It is. It is concern. It is very concerning because I think,
Yep.
like you said, Iowa does get the benefit of the doubt of anytime they're on someone's schedule. Ooh, that's a really tough game. And you're seeing now. You know what they kind of remind me of? They remind me of the Steelers of the NFL.
Yeah.
They will never be terrible. Like they will always be bare minimum a really competent, smart team. But they have so much limitation on offense that when they
Mhm.
play the good or the great teams, like they're not even close. Like you said, the last 8 games they've lost against AP ranked teams has been by an average of 4 touchdowns. They're not in the same zip code anymore. And so it feels like they're stuck in the middle, which I think you could argue, Trip, is the worst spot to be in sports. Maybe college football is a
Mhm.
little bit different compared to the pros, but it's like if you look at Iowa, sure, they could beat Rutgers. They could beat Minnesota. Like
Maybe.
they could beat
Maybe.
That's true. And maybe not even Rutgers. Like they could beat the
Yeah.
middle tier to lower tier Big Ten teams, and they could beat the poorly coached teams, no problem. But like when you need them to make a play, they have not made a play in years. And it's
And
like
when
you
they're
see
they don't have the chance. They don't have the chance to go on the road and do it. When they're at home, that's the toughest environment in the Big Ten. Right up there, Penn State, Ohio State. The stands are so close. Any player will tell you how loud and difficult that is. And the fans get behind the defense. They start playing that field position game. They shorten the game. They're good at home, but I'm sorry, but that doesn't travel. And you're right. Like they are stuck in no man's land right now. And yeah, they probably would beat a Rutgers, Nebraska. But you don't go into Ohio State or Oregon or Penn State or Michigan last year or Washington even against those teams you mentioned and think, I don't know, this is a great matchup. Those are teams with a lot of skill and talent. And if they would get tripped up by a Nebraska, Rutgers, Maryland, like Illinois, you just they can overpower them with overall talent. Iowa can't do that. And I just think and this isn't a knock because they've been so successful. They just happen to be the best of the rest. And they happen to have the best home field advantage of the rest.
and it
I
feels like like would you say they peaked under Kirk
yeah.
Ferentz? Like I don't see how this gets any better.
Yeah, I honestly don't either. And that's look, when you had divisions, and we talked about this one of the first episodes we did, when you have divisions, there's a path. What is the path for Iowa? You know, the margin is so slim because of how they play. You're going to lose games. You're just going to. And what is the path for them right now? Because that margin is so slim every single week. And it's really, really difficult.
And I wonder if you're an Iowa fan, like where are your expectations at? Like, are you
Mhm.
trying to compete and be the best, or do you want to just be relevant? Because 8-4 is relevant. Maybe you can sneak into the rankings early in the year and have a 21 by your name and get excited. Oh, we're gonna go to Michigan and we're gonna keep it close and we're gonna get some turnovers and we're gonna maybe win this game. But it's like you said, like when you play some of the best teams in the country, you are not close. And there's no recipe right now with how college football is played offensively and where Iowa is offensively. You are nowhere close to closing the gap. If anything, these stats, like you said, 8 straight AP top 25 losses by an average of 4 touchdowns, that gap is widening. You have regressed and gone the other way as every other team right now is getting closer. Like, I don't know if this is a hot take or not. I think I'd rather be Michigan State right now going forward. Not right now, but going forward. I feel like they're window to compete and their path is a lot clearer right now and better than Iowa's.
If you look at Iowa, and yeah, they've won the Big Ten West in 2 of the last 3 years. But here are their records going back: 10-4, 8-5, 10-4, 10-3, 9-4, 8-5, 8-5. None of those seasons get you in a playoff. It gets you a Big Ten West. You beat up on teams that you can. But again, they are the best of the rest, and I agree. I think they peaked, and it's only going to get more challenging in the Big Ten. And a team that they have to recruit against now, right? You would say Nebraska has passed them. Nebraska, a quality win, 14-7 against Rutgers. Rutgers was unbeaten going into that game. And I think you saw the growth of Dylan Raiola. Yeah, it's not a big offensive game, but they relied on their defense. They didn't make the big mistake, and they were the team that found a way to take advantage of Rutgers' mistakes to win it 14-7 over the weekend. And Nebraska, in that recruiting base, same as Iowa, I put them on the Big Ten pedestal moving forward, the hierarchy. I think Nebraska's ahead of them.
I mean, you look Indiana,
Mhm.
Illinois, Nebraska, a lot of these teams that for a while Iowa was better than
Yep.
and looked down upon, like you said, have passed them. It's really, really concerning here. I'm glad you brought up that Nebraska Rutgers game. Trip, I don't think I've ever seen a game play out the way that Rutgers Nebraska game played out from Rutgers' offensive perspective
Yep.
here. Where you look, they got into Nebraska territory 9 different times. Here's how those drives ended. They scored 1 touchdown. They had 1 fake field goal that did not work. They had 1 missed field goal, 1 interception, 1 turnover on downs, 1 drop touchdown by Ben Black. He was wide open, just hit off his shoulder pad. Look, just absolute lack of concentration there. Made up for it later with a touchdown reception, but that could have been a big game-changing play. And 4 punts. 9 drives into Nebraska territory, and you got 1 touchdown, including a goal line stand, too. We got the ball inside the 10-yard line. 4 plays went nowhere. Offense, that is just an absolute disaster.
But we were just talking about margins. The way Rutgers plays with their offense, you're relying on a good defense, running game on offense for the most part, even though they've been, I think Monangai has been good all year, probably not great, but really good. One of the best backs in the Big Ten. Their margin is so thin, you cannot afford to not take advantage. And that's ultimately the way their season goes now, right? They've already found a way to win close games at Virginia Tech, against Washington, but you lose one now because your margin's so thin. And when you don't have the talent, and I hate to keep going back to it, but what separates those teams from Penn State, Oregon, and Ohio State? They don't have the talent to overcome that. Your margin is thin, and that's why teams like Rutgers can't. We talk, could they go undefeated? Oh, what kind of run could they go on? Well, they can't, because the margin is not big enough. As optimistic as you are, it's almost impossible to win 1-score games every single week, because something's going to happen.
And that's why I wanted to wait on Rutgers, kind of seeing how this game went. And they had, going in, again, advantages where Nebraska's offense at times was questionable. Their defense was questionable. Their special teams as well. But end of the day, boy, oh boy, we saw Rutgers, like you said, that margin of error being too thin. You can win some games, but you can't win every game the way Rutgers has tried to win here in the last few weeks, and they did get burned by it. Really quickly, before we get to our Big Ten rankings to close out the show, I like this stat that you pulled and looking ahead to week number 7 here. When you look at the time change, when you look at teams in this conference traveling 2 or more time zones, they are 1-7 so far this year. The lone win being Indiana going on the road at UCLA. You look at Penn State going at USC, Ohio State going at Oregon here. How much, because we may not talk about this a lot in the general sense of breaking down on Thursday, how much is the travel, the first real cross-country travel for both of these teams in Penn State, Ohio State, how much of an impact, if any, do you think it will have on this game or these games?
I think it's a real thing, but Penn State's leaving on Thursday to acclimate to USC. This is the nature of the beast now, and that no program is going to use that as an excuse. I think it's a real thing to travel, but it's a charter flight. You're staying at a nice hotel. I don't think you can point to it and say, oh, this is why. This is why. In the Big Ten and the ACC, I mean, look at Miami going to Cal and somehow escaped. I do think it is a real thing, but it's not something no one cares, right? The fans aren't going to care. Media's not going to care. College Football Playoff Committee probably not going to use it in their evaluation of teams. While it is a thing, you have to try to manage it. It's an interesting stat. It is worth watching throughout the course of the year. But what does it truly really matter, right?
Did you notice it at all with UCLA? You were on the sidelines for Penn State UCLA. They left on Friday, which is an interesting strategy. They left the day before the game. Obviously, it was at noon Eastern, so 9 a.m. body clock. After the game, Deshaun Foster said, hey, we got off to a good start. That was not the problem. Would you agree with that?
My biggest takeaway from that game is that Penn State needs to start faster on the road, and they're going to have to do that in that game against USC. Penn State's had some slow starts this year getting in rhythm offensively.
Yeah.
Defensively, UCLA moved down the field as well. Opening drives have been a problem for the Penn State defense, even though they've locked it down after that. My biggest takeaway from that game, whatever, like UCLA, the travel. Again, I don't think anyone really cares. It's a thing, but no one cares. My takeaway from that game, Penn State needs to start faster, but once they got in rhythm, Penn State was physical. They did it without Nicholas Singleton. You could see that their offense lacked the explosion of Singleton. As good as Katron Allen has been for them, they missed Singleton's explosive ability in the running game, but it was good for Penn State to get other receivers involved, like a Julian Fleming. Liam Clifford had a big day, over 100 yards on 3 catches, some big third down conversion catches from Drew Aller. And Penn State's third down conversion offense was really good. They're 6 for 6 in the second quarter when they took that game over. Travel, it is a thing, but Penn State, UCLA, my biggest takeaway is Penn State starts fast and puts 4 quarters together. It's going to be fascinating to see Penn State on the road at USC, Ohio State on the road at Oregon. Huge week coming up, and bearing those results, who knows what November 2nd could have in store in Happy Valley.
You are right about that. It's going to be a great week, so make sure you do subscribe wherever you do get your podcasts. And on YouTube, a huge huge Week 7 preview coming your way on Thursday here. Before we get out of here, let's show the nice little graph. Oh, look at that. A
Oh, yeah.
nice
Our YouTube
fancy
audience.
graphic. Yes, if you're listening on your podcast, we appreciate you. If you want to check it out here, go to our YouTube page to look at this beautiful graphic we have where Trip
Wow.
and I rank all 18 Big Ten teams. And if you're watching right now on YouTube, you can tell a lot of our rankings are very, very similar. Top 5 identical. Ohio State 1, Penn State 2, followed by Oregon, Indiana, Illinois 3, 4, 5. The bottom 5 as well are the same. Michigan State 14, Maryland 15, Northwestern, UCLA, and Purdue. Like we told you before, the bottom 5 teams. The biggest mover, Trip, I would say in this, would you agree, is Minnesota hopping up to number 12?
Yeah, I think Minnesota hopping up. I have them at 13. You have them at 12. I think they showed that, okay, Max Brosmer, PJ Fleck, the defense, the run game, they haven't quit. They've been in games. They were in that game, had an opportunity at the end against Michigan. For me, the biggest standout is you look at that top 5, and I know you had Indiana up there before and Nebraska up there, but all of a sudden now Michigan and USC drop from top 5, borderline top 5 teams to 8 and 9 in our rankings. And I'll tell you what, the reason why, they have holes. They have major concerns in spots. Indiana and Illinois, Nebraska and Washington, maybe not as explosive, maybe not as experienced, might not have all the 5-star, 4-star talent. But those are more complete football teams right now. And that's why Indiana, Illinois, Nebraska, Washington are 4 through 7 teams. I think that's what stands out most to me in this week's rankings. Washington making a big jump up with their win over Michigan in what was a really good matchup for them. A really good matchup for them at home.
You're right. And it also, I think, changes the trajectory of the seasons going forward because preseason, you look at, okay, who's playing USC? Who's playing Michigan?
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden it's like, well, forget who's playing Indiana. Who can get a quality win against the Hoosiers? Who's playing Illinois here to kind of boost their resume? The strength of schedule, I think, is rapidly changing with USC, like you said, in Michigan, now getting a second loss and seemingly having a few more on the way as well as the season goes on. But guys like Indiana, Illinois, Nebraska kind of ramping up as well and jumping up the rankings, Washington as well. A lot of those maybe afterthought teams before the season now all of a sudden become marquee matchups. And so it's going to be really interesting to see how this season does play out now going forward. But I think these rankings, like you said, highlight so far the uncertainty through the first 6 weeks of the season and some of the surprise teams that we've seen, both good and bad, that have really kind of mirrored the surprise we've seen so far in college football, especially here in week 6, where chaos reigns supreme and 6 top 25 teams do go down. All right, appreciate you joining us here on Still Enrolled, a Big Ten football podcast. Again, we got a huge episode coming on Thursday, so make sure you're subscribing on YouTube. Make sure you're subscribing wherever you do get your pods. Big Week 7 preview, USC, Penn State, Ohio State, Oregon, obviously the 2 headliner games that will break down everything going on in the conference on Thursday. So we'll talk to you then. Have a great rest of your week.